Hi everyone, welcome to our latest episode of Tune Into Data, Responsible Gambling Special Edition. I'm Edmund, Head of Data here at Future Anthem, and with me today I've got Kevin Clegg, Vice President of Environmental Social Governance at Ballys, and I've also got Dan Waugh, Partner at Regulus Partners. And today we're going to basically discussing as kind of a topic on everyone's mind, which is the Gambling Commission's new guidance for at-risk customers. So we're just recording this at the end of May, but probably release in the next couple of days. But we do expect the GC to issue some further guidance in June. But we thought today we'd have a quick discussion and see if we can maybe help educate people on how they should approach this, how it might change in the future, and how they can help prepare themselves going forward. So let's jump in straight into it, guys, if you don't mind. Unless anyone has anything they want to say, but let's just kind of focus first on what they have kind of said in the first bullet point, which is, the people, operators basically have to monitor a specific range of indicators at a minimum to identify gambling harm. So I think people will be quite familiar with some of these indicators, but I'll just give you a list of what the ones they have mentioned initially, which are customer spend, patterns of spend, time spent gambling behavior indicators, customer-led contact, use of gambling management tools, and then finally account indicators. Now guys, I suppose, as guys who've been in the industry a long time, is there anything there that surprises you? Have you any comment on those ones? Are they missing any, or what are your opinions on those ones? Dan, maybe you first?
Yeah, I don't think they are missing anything, because I think one of the things that's going on here is the Gambling Commission doesn't quite understand the difference between specific and impossibly vague, because the indicators we've got here could encompass pretty much anything. Bearing in mind we've got something here called gambling behaviour indicators. They could simply have put that as a single bullet point. So you've got some things here which are specific, like customer-led contact, use of gambling management tools, but most of the rest of them are impossibly vague. Now, maybe we'll get some helpful guidance on actually what they mean by these when the guidance comes out in June. It's difficult to see why that specific detail wasn't provided in April, which would give operators much greater lead into this. But at the moment, this is pretty much everything.
Do you think that they haven't given, so I think they've said to us that the 12th of September is when these are going to be put in things. Do you think they've given enough time to operators to prepare themselves for this? Or is it just a lack of information?
Well, you have to think that when they set this out, they knew what they wanted to do. In which case, I don't see why they couldn't have provided very much more detailed guidance in April. Why they have to wait till June, I don't understand. And clearly operators would be in a better position if they knew exactly what they had to do in April rather than June. So I'm not sure the Gambling Commission has gone about this in the most helpful way.
Mm-hmm. And
I think just to add on that, it seems to be a consistent process from the GC that they give around 3 months for operators to implement change from a technology perspective. And I think you will know, working in this field, some of these changes that I'm sure that will be coming will be incredibly complex, and to build those into our processes, as well as some of the other ongoing things such as single customer view that is happening at the moment, I think that will be really challenging from a timescale perspective.
Yeah, and also, I at the risk of jumping ahead because this is a subsequent bullet point, but they've also stressed the need for this to be evaluated. Well, in order to evaluate the effect of certain actions, you need first of all to collect baseline data. So by truncating the period between actually telling operators what they need to do, assuming that's what we'll get in June, and I don't think we can be guaranteed that we will get the level of granularity we want, truncating that period really works against putting in place this kind of scientific evaluation they say that they want from this.
I have a kind of quick question on this. So as guys who are as experienced as you have, do you think the Gambling Commission really wants to come in and inspect operators with a fine-tooth comb, or is this more where they want to come in and just be like, we want to see you doing the best that you can do? Do you mean, is it when they're evaluating these companies, what kind of expectations do they have?
Well, I think as a company in Ballys, we're currently going through one of those processes, and what I can tell you is that the Gambling Commission do get into the detail, very much into the detail when it comes to looking at our processes and systems. I think there was also a clue in Marcus Boyle's article in the Times on May the 23rd as to what expectations are and what the future looks like for the Gambling Commission, and that included, as an example, being able to look at accounts on a real-time basis and that being able to feed into the GC. So I think that you get a good indication that it's going to be more about detail and less about generalities.
Oh, right. That's very interesting.
Yeah, I think when you look through the Gambling Commission enforcement cases, you see two things going on here. First of all, there are some egregious failings. There are some absolutely shocking failings by some operators where customers are being allowed to spend huge sums of money with very little checks. And the Gambling Commission is absolutely right to come down hard where those occur. But I think in the reporting, what we don't get is a sense of proportion. There are millions of people, I think according to the Gambling Commission data, sort of somewhere in the region of 6 million people gambling online in a month. And we are seeing these highly egregious failings, but there is a sense, to what extent are these the exceptions to the way operators are behaving, and to what extent are these the rule? And the way the Gambling Commission goes about communicating this is often to sort of imply that these failings are widespread. But you can only know they're widespread if you produce the data. And at the moment, what we're seeing is pretty shocking examples of failings being described without really any foundation as being endemic within the industry.
So very interesting point, guys. But one thing you kind of mentioned there that I found especially interesting, Kevin, was kind of the expectations of kind of going forward. You said kind of in a real time kind of capacity, and that's kind of something here, kind of Future Anthem, we take kind of very seriously. So I always kind of found that whenever I kind of spoke to GC in terms of their expectations, one of the kind of the lines they said to me, this is back in my industry days, was that any kind of technology or tools or processes that you're using kind of to make money from the customer in a commercial sense, you should be really using them also to protect the customer. Do you mean? And I think this is where kind of there has been a bit of a lag in kind of wider industry to, like, if you can, almost in a real time offer promotion or some sort of sign up benefit, you should be able to basically monitor a player in terms of their, protecting those players in real time. So I in my opinion, I think, a lot of these things are hinting towards that, is in that, like, yes, you might have had, tools, that maybe some people might do it once a week, some people might do it in a daily sense in terms of scanning their player base to understand the types of behaviours. But realistically, with the state-of-the-art technology that exists right now, you should really, really be able to kind of interact in real time. Yeah,
I think there's some thing in that, but at the same time, we're looking at different behaviours here. So where operators using data for commercial ends, it's really about taking a very sort of mass market approach in large groups of customers and traditional marketing techniques, which are very hit or miss, and trying to get them a bit less scattergun. I think when you're looking at problem gambling or harmful gambling, what you're doing is trying to understand something that's very complex. It's not simply as a decision as to whether to buy something or not something. You're looking at disordered behaviour, and you're looking generally at a relatively small cadre of customers. So I'm not sure it's quite as easy as saying you use the tools you're using for commercial purposes for harm prevention, because harm prevention requires so much greater specificity, which is why I think actually for harm prevention the data analytics approach has to be superior to the commercial approach in many respects.
I completely agree, and maybe I kind of probably phrased it wrong, as in trying to, maybe if it was taken as an easy thing. I just meant as in that we do know now that when I speak to some colleagues, that one of the things they're trying to do is focus on personalization. So how do you personalize the experience in the gambling website, which is, learning from what other players have done, and then basically using that to basically, map a journey on the site that a player will particularly enjoy. But it's you're right, it's actually much more difficult to actually then understand problematic play, because if you can see there's so many more indicators, so many more ways to measure the risk going on. But I'm just saying is in terms of the ability just to measure it in real time. Do you mean to put that information into models? But yeah, I totally agree. I suppose in the next kind of thing, so that was we kind of spoke there about the specific indicators, but here, so the second one, just kind of what you were saying, Kevin, was to flag indicators of harm and take action in a timely manner. So they are saying that. Do you mean? So I think the UKGC are very, very aware of that.
I think the other thing that Marcus mentioned in his article, which I think is very interesting from a data perspective, is that they're looking to standardise the way that algorithms work in the gambling industry, because there are lots of different approaches to that, and I think that some are more effective than others, and without a doubt the GC have found this as a point of interest, and they're looking to do some work around what is the most effective way of getting to harm before it actually takes place.
We were speaking about that earlier, Dan, for like, can you standardise basically kind of measuring harm?
I think measuring harm is very difficult. I mean, because first of all you have to define what you mean by harm, and then you have to try to identify where the linkages between the harm and the gambling are. So I think that is difficult, but I do think some sort of standardisation around one, the processes that operators take to identify customers who may be vulnerable, and two, potentially the levels at which various different interactions have to take place. I think some degree of standardisation is required there. There will be a balance between a level of standardisation that gives the regulator assurance in the way operators are behaving and the need to avoid stifling innovation. Because again, we come back to disordered gambling or harmful gambling, which are two different things, but they are incredibly complex. So the idea that we know enough at now to be able to say this is how we go about identifying it and this is what we do about it is hopelessly optimistic in my view. So I think there's a balance between achieving some level of standardisation so that customers are being treated consistently between different operators, but also keeping the door open to make sure we're constantly inquiring about how to do this better, constantly innovating, constantly upgrading the process. So it needs to be a balance of those things.
And do you think that they both need to lead, or do you think the UKGC need to lead more on that? Like, I know it's a difficult question, but
I think it's disappointing for me personally that the industry has not done more around standardisation to date, because they've had ample opportunity to take the lead on this. I think that the problem with the regulator leading on this is, and this is not meant to be a disparaging comment, it's simply a fact of life, the regulator does not understand this territory as well as the operators do, in terms at least of what the analytic processes are. The regulator possibly has better insight in terms of what might constitute harmful gambling, but I think a regulator-led process, one, is probably not what the GC wants because it puts them on the hook for this, and two, I just think we'll probably get less intelligent solutions that way.
Yeah, I suppose, speaking from a future Anthem perspective, I kind of would agree with that. The industry has the technological experts to basically kind of be able to look at the vast quantities of data there is. For example, here at Future Anthem, we've recently achieved, I think, over like 55 billion transactions. And when you're dealing with that kind of, Excel isn't going to cut it anymore. Like, no insult to Excel fadnados over there, but you need some serious computing power to be able to kind of ingest it and B, then kind of understand it. So.
Yeah, and I think we've got to be really careful here, because we have seen a number of proposals, particularly from some certain think tanks, which actually want to say no, the data comes into a central repository where the state monitors the behaviour of online gambling consumers, and then the state takes the decision about what happens with them. I think that is incredibly dystopian. We had this proposal from the Centre of Social Justice, which was supported by Ian Duncan Smith, by Carolyn Harris, and by senior members of the NHS, which said, if you want to buy a single lottery ticket, forget online gambling, you want to buy a single lottery ticket in this country, you have to provide the state access to your private banking account so that the state can monitor what you're doing. I mean, that is incredibly concerning. Yeah. But I think those are the sort of, hopefully we won't go there, but those are the possibilities when the industry fails to take leadership on this.
Yeah.
I think as well, just further to Dan's point, I think different operators have different risk appetites and indeed appetite for safer gambling. So I think that there are a number of operators that are very proactive in this area. They're leading the way. They're investing huge amounts of capital to try and create the best solutions. But then you have some operators that are just not investing enough and are not really meeting the standards that the Gambling Commission requires. And I think that that's why you see the kind of action that the GC is taking is that there are some operators that are just quite simply too slow to react and to respond. And I think that it's difficult for those operators that are proactive. They are investing huge amounts of money to try and minimise harm. Unfortunately, there is a lag in some of the operators that means that the GC has to take the action that it's taking right now.
Do you think there's a correlation between the size of the company and then their inaction, or do you think basically there's, just any size company can?
Look, I think it'd be a sweeping generalisation to say that. In my in my experience, the leading operators, the larger operators who have got more to lose, I would say, they need to show that they are responsible. They need to show that they're investing heavily and taking problem gambling seriously. You tend to find that those are the companies that are investing the most and are the most proactive in the industry around this area.
Yeah, and I think the Gambling Commission, I think rightly in the past has adopted an approach which is around high impact operators, because they've got a huge number of licensees to patrol. They don't have the resources to look after every licensee in detail. So what they do is they say, well, where are most of the customers transacting? Let's focus a lot of resource on those high impact operators, because that's where we will achieve the greatest protections for our consumers. And I think that's an entirely legitimate approach from the GC. I think where you do have smaller operators and resource is an issue, well, that really supports the GC's argument for greater standardisation here, because the more this is standardised, the easier it is for the smaller operators to really leverage the work that the larger operators are doing.
And at the risk of selling Future Anthem, that's where you've got other companies, third parties that can definitely come in and help you in these areas. Yeah,
absolutely. I think there's another thing, and this is something we've talked about in the past, but there's another aspect here, and we come on to it when the Gambling Commission talks about prevent marketing and take up of new bonuses for at-risk customers. But what's an at-risk customer? Well, the Problem Gambling Severity Index provides a definition of an at-risk customer, but that is not the same definition that operators using in their internal analytics systems. So there is an issue, I think, which somebody at some point has got to crack, is how do you bridge the gap between how operators and third-party providers like Future Anthem assess risk and how the psychiatric community has historically assessed risk. Because until that happens, you will always have a mistrust, because operators are defining risk, but nobody knows on what basis. So I think we need to see greater transparency around these models, and I think in particular building that bridge between how the psychiatric community thinks about disordered gambling and how the operators think about at-risk gambling is critical.
Totally agree. And Kevin, I suppose can move on to the previous bullet point there in terms of implemented automated processes of strong indicators of harm. Is that something that you found challenging in your work in terms of getting the processes set up, or is that easy?
It's not, and it takes time. I think that it depends what perspective you're looking at. If you're looking at progression all the time, if you're looking at constantly reviewing and updating your processes, we have a system where we're constantly reviewing our processes, and in terms of listening to the guidance, looking at where the fines have taken place, and indeed working with partners such as yourself to come in, have a look at our algorithm and make sure that we're monitoring the right things. I think that if your frame of reference is that you're constantly looking to improve, then it's not that difficult. But if it is that you don't have that frame of reference and you want to get away with the minimum that you can do, I think you're going to find that when these new rules come into place in September, and indeed some of the measures that might be coming in through the white paper, you're going to find that you're going to be behind the eight ball, and you're going to have a lot of work to do to catch up.
That makes a lot of sense. From my time in with an operator, is like the second you take the eye off the ball, then it can prove very, very, very expensive.
I think that part of it has got to be cultural. It's got to be important to you. It's got to be important to your employees, and you have to take it really seriously. If it is something that you aren't constantly reviewing and constantly developing, I think you'll find that you'll be foul of the GC guidance, and indeed It's what our customers expect of us now. They expect to be taken care of. They expect us to be proactive in this area. Our stakeholders expect that as well. And I think any company that underestimates how external stakeholders feel about their performance in this area are making a big mistake.
That's actually really interesting. At the risk of going on a slight tangent, do you have any? Have you had any different opinions on how the different generations of kind of players are taking it? For example, the younger players. In my experience, younger people have a higher expectation in general, just of being, not adhere to in a negative sense, but as in proper processes have been taking place to take care of them, to make sure that they're not taken advantage of. Is that something you come across?
I think definitely. I think those younger customers have probably got that higher level of expectation. They expect that the technology is there. They know it's there. We tend to find that if they need it, they know where the tools are that can protect them and keep them safe. Some of our older customers, I think that their view is that it's important for them to take the responsibility for themselves. So I definitely think that there's a different mindset and different approach, but that doesn't stop our approach, that we have to really make sure that we're taking care of every single customer.
Interesting.
Yeah. And I think that touches on a fascinating aspect of this whole debate, because I think you can take the Daily Mail view, which is that we're in the situation we're in because the online gambling industry is evil, which is what they write. I tend to look at it and say, actually, what we've seen here is a fairly catastrophic failure of customer service for an industry that was in a high growth phase. So it's not really taking an interest in the well-being of the consumer for too long. And now we're in a position where the focus is all on stopping people doing bad things, right? We really should be flipping this around and saying, actually, no, we as an industry want to give our customers the best service they possibly can. We should be focused on positive well-being, not just stopping bad things happening. And I think if we can flip it around that way, it comes down to customer service. If you're delivering outstanding customer service, then by definition you are not having these egregious enforcement cases occurring, because you care about your customer. And I think that's where we've got to get into a more positive phase, where it is about delivering customer service, because that then flips all this stuff into something that's commercially viable. It's not simply a question of staying out of trouble. It's actually about ensuring sustainable business relationships with your customers.
So instead of basically focusing on the negative play after it's occurred, it's probably actually looking at the whole population.
But also thinking about, and we've talked about the positive play thing that's come out of Canada in the last decade or so, but it's about actually saying, how do we deliver really positive experience for our customers, for all of our customers? One of the problems with this sort of the focus on problem gambling or harmful gambling is that you're generally looking at a minority of your customer base and you're trying to stop them doing things. I think it's far more empowering to say, let's look at all our customers and let's challenge ourselves to deliver positive well-being for all of our customers.
Yeah, totally agree.
So, something that we've done just on that point, and further to speaking to Dan around the positive play, we've introduced a campaign called Game in Good Hands, which is just that, which is a customer promise to say to our customers in the UK, we're here to look after you, and these are the tools that you can have, and generally we're here to help. Absolutely, the point that Dan makes as well is that commercially it's so much better for us to have long-term relationships with our customers. So from a commercial perspective, it's absolutely the right approach to take.
100%. I'm sick of my own perspective back when I was working an operator. It's kind of one of those things, from if you're outside the industry, it seems strange, but it's in both the interest of the player and of the operator that people don't have problems. You don't want them to self-exclude. You don't want them to disappear, because you want that customer to come in, enjoy betting at their own safe level for as long as possible, rather than have a bad experience and disappear. Do you know what I mean? So I think that makes total sense. The next bullet point here is evaluate their interactions and ensure they interact with consumers at least at the level of problem gambling for the relevant activity. It's a bit of a mouthful and quite vague in my opinion. Dan, do you have any kind of understanding of what they're trying to ask there?
Yeah, look, I think evaluation is critical, but it's also quite hard unless you know specifically what you're trying to do. And it's worth saying as well, we've just concluded the last 3-year strategy for the National Strategy for Reduction of Gambling Harm. with zero evaluation from the Gambling Commission. So, you know, there's an opportunity for the Gambling Commission to show leadership here around evaluation. I think one of the problems with the way this is worded is this idea of the level of problem gambling for the relevant activity. Now, health surveys do provide us with problem gambling prevalence rates for consumers who do different activities. But to be very clear, this is problem gambling rates for consumers, not for the activity. So we know, for example, that people who engage in online sports betting have relatively low problem gambling prevalence rates. People who engage in spread betting have relatively high problem gambling rates. But it's not absolutely clear that those rates attach to the products because these customers are doing multiple things. And in general, you see problem gambling rates higher amongst people who are doing lots of things. So it's the clustering of activities that's relevant here. So it'd be interesting to see what the Gambling Commission provides in terms of further guidance there. We might end up in a situation where they sort of block them together and say things like online sports betting, relatively low risk. I was going to say FOBTs, but they're not around anymore. Dog racing typically comes out as a relatively high risk product. Online slots are relatively high risk. So maybe we'll see some sort of rough categorization amongst groups of products.
And I suppose the next one then, Kevin, so evidence their customer interaction evaluation to the Gambling Commission during routine casework. I presume that's something that you're very familiar with.
Yeah, and that includes, so when the GC comes in and does an assessment of a business, they will tend to ask for a list primarily of your largest depositors, people that have lost an amount of money. And what they're looking at then is that they will then pick some of these customers and they will absolutely go into specific detail around every opportunity that we've had to interact with that customer, levels of spend, conversations that we've had. And I think that from the GC's perspective, they want to be able to see the journey of how potentially harm has occurred or not, and taken a look at our processes to make sure that they're robust. So they want to see at what level did we interact, at what point did we come to the conclusion that that customer had not suffered harm, at what point should we have intervened, if we should have intervened earlier, should we have set a limit, what kind of conversations did we have, did we establish occupation, job, etc., what level of spend the customer was comfortable with, and in some cases, of course, did you get the necessary documentation that was provide evidence that that level of spend was affordable. So I think really what that will be is just that clarification of what the GC expects, and you know, quite understandably they want to make sure that the evidence is there, that when they come to check that your processes are robust, you have the evidence to be able to portray it.
I think that builds upon what you said earlier, is that you also have to show that you're learning. Do you know what I mean? So it's that, like, when you are reviewing these cases, reviewing your processes, that how you interact with these customers, how you log all that information, that you're taking whatever learning you've had in the past and then basically building upon that in the future.
Absolutely, and we will do that again. So the recent assessment that we've had with the GC, we engaged in constructive conversations about how we could improve, and ultimately that will mean that we will seek to implement those recommendations and discussions as quickly as possible. I think where we find ourselves, that we think actually maybe we could have got to that a little bit earlier, maybe there was a hole in our net of processes that we need to fill. I think that if you look at it from that perspective, that you're constantly evolving, that you're constantly wanting to improve, I think the GC take that on board and see that actually if you're coming at it from that mindset, that they will engage constructively and positively with you to try and help.
100%. And then the last one here, then comply with. It's one that actually I found particularly interesting. Comply with these requirements at all times. This includes ensuring the compliance of third-party providers. Now, obviously, there's the obvious third parties that make sense, but interesting. Does anyone think this might go down to studios at some stage? It's a dangerous question, possibly, but
Again, more detail helps.
Yeah.
So vague statements around third-party providers, which is a huge ecosystem, isn't very helpful at this point. I mean, maybe it sort of extends to companies like Future Anthem,
I think,
who are doing a lot of the analytics work to make sure that but you know, affiliates maybe as well because of marketing.
I think that's a really good point, because how they source customers, what methods they're using, who they're trying to target. Do you mean, I think you can't really hide behind that, can you?
But greater detail.
Yeah, more detail required, definitely, as Dan has said. I think already you're seeing some of that examples around ASA regulations with affiliates, like Dan has said, is that some of those processes are already implemented, and really we're aware that it's our responsibility that if we are working with an affiliate, we have to make sure that they're operating within the guidelines.
Makes total sense.
So it's not new, but more detail required, definitely.
And just before we go, I just have hopefully an interesting question for Bodhi. What's going to happen after this? Do you think, do you think that they will help be a bit? Would you think the GC will be a bit more specific? Where's these regulations headed?
So I think it would definitely be helpful if they were more specific. I mean, they can't be less specific at this point. Let's face it. But the Commission has got a sort of a bit of a track record of being potentially deliberately non-specific, because that then affords them great latitude in terms of how they assess the performance of licensees. So we have to be wary of that. I think there's two other things that I think are interesting that could be potential developments on this. First of all, they mentioned in this guidance the single customer view pilot. So there is a question about at what point does this guidance to operators start to apply across an entire customer's gambling repertoire? So there is, how does this play into the single view of customer? I think it's an interesting question. I think the second thing is, if we go back to where this started, where this consultation started, the headline was about £100 per month spending limits, with customers having to provide bank statements and tax returns in order to exceed that. Now, so far, the Gambling Commission has been completely silent on that. The only thing it says in here is that they're going to have another consultation on affordability at some point. So, perhaps they didn't like what they got out of the first consultation. We're not clear, but that must be the sort of concern, is that you set up this, this infrastructure here for customer monitoring, and then you come back. Customer spend is the first item on their list. Does affordability checks at relatively low levels of expenditure come back in at some point?
Kevin?
I mean, I believe that the guidance in June will be greatly influenced perhaps by the content of the white paper that will be coming, and I think that white paper will also have an impact on the role of the GC going forward, and I think Dan mentioned the consultation that probably will delve even further and deeper into affordability. But what is not clear at this stage is how specific DCMS is going to be around affordability and what measures it's looking to implement. I think as well, what I would hope to see in these guidelines, and Dan mentioned it earlier, is that process of evaluation, which I think is a huge weakness for the GC, in that we constantly shift and implement new measures and new processes without going through the process of evaluating whether they've been effective in the first instance. And I think that the industry has moved forward significantly. Some of the operators, like I say, those that have been proactive and those that clearly can see how important that is over the last 3 or 4 years. And this is why I think we've seen the improvement in the prevalence figures and the low gambling rates, is that lots of change has taken place that is positive. But I think that there's also that process of evaluation that needs to take place to make sure that we're doing the right things before we go on and implement new measures, which might just not be as effective as the GC is hoping for. So if anything, I'd like to see some of the guidelines that come out in June around how they're planning to evaluate the measures they're looking to implement.
I think that's kind of the consensus here, basically, kind of going forward, isn't it? All right, well, listen, I'd like to thank everyone for watching today. I'd especially like to thank these two titans for their time, and we give it back to them because it's probably gone a slightly bit overboard. But please stay tuned for our next Tune Into Data, and that's it. Thank you very much.